I'm Dean Goodwin, and today I'm going to read you the tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go down into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Now, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, snuck underneath the pen and went right into Mr. McGregor's garden. First he ate lettuce, and then beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling kind of sick, he went to look for some parsley. But around the end of a cucumber frame, who should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate, but he lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and another one among the potatoes, and after losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with nice brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost. He shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. But Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve. And he wanted to pop it on top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. He rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, but it was full of water. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, maybe hidden underneath a flower pot, so he began to turn them over, carefully looking under each one. Peter sneezed. "Achoo!" And Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. He tried to put his feet on Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter, so he just went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath, trembling with fright. He had not the least idea which way to go, and he was very damp after sitting in that can. So after a time, he began to wander about, kind of lippity, not very fast, just looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. There was an old mouse who was running in and out over the stone steps, carrying peas and beans back to her family. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had a large pea in her mouth and he couldn't answer. So she only shook her head, and Peter began to cry. He tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Soon he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor had filled his water cans, and a white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very still, but now and then the tip of her tail would just twitch as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her, because he'd heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. So he went back to the tool shed. But suddenly, quite close to where he was, he heard a sound of a hoe. Scritch, scritch, scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed on a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was toward Peter, and beyond him, the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and he started running as fast as he could go. A straight walk was right in front of him, right behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him, but Peter didn't care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood behind the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket with the brass buttons for the scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds out of his garden. Peter never stopped running, never looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down on the nice soft sand of the floor of his rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking and wondered what he'd done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter did not fare very well that evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail all had bread and milk and blackberries for dinner. The end.